September 28, 1944, 28,000 feet over the English Channel. Flight Lieutenant John Jack Hammond gripped his Spitfire control stick. The 24-year-old RAF pilot's knuckles whitened under his leather gloves. Below, the gray water stretched to the horizon. Ahead, a dark shape materialized from the clouds. It was small, sleek, and moving faster than anything he'd ever seen. Hammond's eyes widened. He'd heard rumors of German rocket planes. But this was different. It didn't climb like a rocket. It sliced through the air with a high-pitched whine. Hammond thumbed the radio. Tally-ho! Bandit, 10 o'clock high. Speed. God, it's fast. The shape bank left. Sun glinted off its metallic fuselage. Hammond pushed his Spitfire to full throttle. 360 miles per hour. 370. The gap didn't close. If anything, it widened. The German jet vanished into the clouds. Hammond stared after it. He knew one thing for sure. The air war over Europe had just changed forever. The aircraft Hammond had seen was the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, the Swallow, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter. Its origins did not begin in a burst of wartime urgency alone. They trace back to 1938, when German aeronautical engineers first dared to challenge the dominance of piston engines and propellers. At that time, every major military air force relied on reciprocating engines. These machines had evolved steadily since World War I. They powered fighters like the British Spitfire and German Bf 109, but they had hard limits. Propeller tips could not exceed the speed of sound without creating destructive turbulence. Engine power dropped sharply at high altitudes, where thin air starred combustion. German military leaders, already planning for future conflicts, wanted a breakthrough. Something that could outfly any potential enemy. Something that could render existing fighters obsolete. Something that could give the Luftwaffe an unbeatable edge. The man tasked with turning this vision into metal was Willy Messerschmitt, a 40-year-old engineer who had already left his mark on aviation. His company, Messerschmitt AG, had designed the Bf 109. That fighter had become the backbone of the Luftwaffe, scoring thousands of victories in the early years of the war. Messerschmitt was not just a designer. He was a visionary. He saw jet propulsion as the key to breaking the piston engine's limits. In 1939, he assembled a team of 30 engineers and technicians. They set up shop in a converted factory on the outskirts of Augsburg. Their goal was clear: build a jet-powered fighter that could fly faster than 500 miles per hour. The first and greatest challenge was the engine. A piston engine with propeller could not deliver the thrust needed for extreme speed. The team needed a jet engine. The solution came from Hans von Ohain, a 26-year-old physicist from Göttingen University. Von Ohain had been experimenting with jet propulsion since 1935. He had developed a centrifugal flow jet engine. It worked by drawing air through intake. A rotating compressor spun at 18,000 revolutions per minute, squeezing the air into a combustion chamber. Fuel was injected into the compressed air and ignited. The hot, expanding gases shot out the rear nozzle. This created thrust. It was a simple principle, but executing it was fraught with difficulties. Von Ohain's first working engine, the Hughes 3B, was tested in early 1939. It produced 550 pounds of thrust, enough to power a small aircraft, but not a fighter. Messerschmitt's team built a prototype fuselage around the engine. They added a tail, wings, and a cockpit. The result was the Me 262 V1. It took flight on April 18, 1941, but it was not a pure jet. Messerschmitt, fearing engine failure, had insisted on adding a 750 horsepower piston engine in the nose. It drove a small propeller. The test flight was a qualified success. The plane reached 340 miles per hour, faster than any piston fighter of the time. But the jet engine overheated after 12 minutes. It seized up. The pilot, Fritz Wendell, had to rely on the piston engine to land. The team went back to the drawing board. Over the next 15 months, the engineers refined both engine and airframe. They redesigned the He's 3BS combustion chamber. They added better cooling systems. They strengthened the turbine blades to handle higher temperatures. By early 1942, they had a new engine, the He's 8A. It produced 1,100 pounds of thrust. It could run for 30 minutes without failure. Messerschmitt's team discarded the piston engine. They built a new prototype, the Me 262 V3. This time, two He's 8A engines were mounted under the wings. The placement reduced drag. It also made maintenance easier. The wings were swept back slightly, a radical design choice. Messerschmitt had calculated that swept wings would reduce drag at high speeds. They would also improve stability. The Me 262 V3 took flight on July 18, 1942. Fritz Wendell was again at the controls. He later described the takeoff. The engines whined like a swarm of hornets. The plane accelerated faster than any fighter I'd flown. At 180 miles per hour, I pulled back on the stick. It lifted off smoothly. No vibration. No torque from a propeller. It was like flying a ghost. Wendell pushed the throttle to full. The plane reached 540 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. It climbed at 3,500 feet per minute. It outperformed every Allied fighter by a wide margin. The test flight lasted 28 minutes. When Wendell landed, the engineers swarmed the plane. They found no major issues. The jet age had arrived. Word of the test reached Adolf Hitler in Berlin. He demanded a personal demonstration. In November 1942, Messerschmitt and Wendell flew the Me 262 V3 to a military airfield outside the city. Hitler watched from a viewing stand. Wendell performed a series of maneuvers. He dived from 10,000 feet to 5,000 feet. He reached 520 miles per hour. He climbed back to altitude in 90 seconds. Hitler was impressed, but he had a different vision for the plane. He did not want a fighter. He wanted a bomber, a jet-powered bomber that could strike London and return without being intercepted. Messerschmitt argued against the change. The Me 262's airframe was not designed for bombing. It had a small internal fuel capacity. Adding bombs would increase weight. This would slow the plane to 470 miles per hour. It would make it vulnerable to Allied fighters. But Hitler was adamant. He ordered the plane to be modified to carry two 500-pound bombs under the wings. The modification process took 6 months. The team reinforced the wing spars to handle the bomb weight. They added bomb racks and release mechanisms. They increased the fuel capacity by adding external drop tanks. The first bombing prototype, the Me 262A-2A, flew in March 1943. The tests were a disaster. The added weight made the plane sluggish. It could not climb as fast. It could not outrun AP-51 Mustang. The bombs were inaccurate. The plane's stability at low altitude was poor. Hitler finally relented in May 1943. He allowed Messerschmitt to resume work on the fighter version, but the delay had cost precious time. The Allies had begun their strategic bombing campaign. Their bombers were hitting German factories. The Me-262 program now faced a new enemy, attrition. The first production model, the Me-262A-1A, rolled off the assembly line in April 1944. It was a refined version of the V-3 prototype. The engines were now Junkers Jumo 00 4B jet engines. The Jumo 004B was an axial flow design. It had 12 compressor stages. It produced 1,980 pounds of thrust. It was more reliable than Vaughan O'Hane's earlier engine, but still fragile. Its lifespan was only 25 hours. The fuselage was 34 feet 9 inches long. The wingspan was 41 feet 3 inches. The plane weighed 8,378 pounds empty, fully loaded with fuel and ammunition. It weighed 14,110 pounds. The wings were swept back at 18.5 degrees. This reduced drag at transonic speeds. The landing gear was retractable. The main gear folded into the wings. The nose gear retracted into the fuselage. The Me-262A-1AS armament was designed for bomber destruction. For 30 million Malawian kwaches, 108 cannons were mounted in the nose. Each cannon fired 65 rounds per minute. The 108 Malawian kwaches used a high-explosive incendiary round. It could penetrate the armor of AB-17 Flying Fortress. A single burst of 3 seconds could destroy a bomber. The plane also carried two 20mm MG-151 cannons in some variants. But the Mk-108s were the primary armament. They were deadly, but they had a short effective range, only 600 yards. This meant Me-262 pilots had to get close to their targets. The performance specifications of the Me-262A-1A were staggering. It had a top speed of 540 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. This was 132 miles per hour faster than the British Spitfire 9. It was 103 miles per hour faster than the American P-51D Mustang. Its climb rate was 3,937 feet per minute. It could reach 30,000 feet in 7 minutes 40 seconds. A P-51D took 12 minutes to reach the same altitude. The Me-262's combat range was 650 miles with two 300-gallon drop tanks. Its service ceiling was 37,500 feet, higher than any Allied fighter could reach with a full load. It could outturn most Allied fighters at speeds above 400 miles per hour. At lower speeds, it was less maneuverable, but its speed more than made up for this. The first operational unit to receive the Me-262 was Jag-Schwader 7 JG-7, Nowotny. The unit was named after Walter Nowotny, a 23-year-old Luftwaffe ace with 258 aerial victories. Nowotny was handpicked by Luftwaffe High Command to lead the unit. He arrived at the unit's base in Akmer, Germany, in July 1944. The first 6 Me-262s were delivered the same month. The pilots selected for JG-7 were all veterans. They had flown BF-109s or FW-190s. They had hundreds of combat hours. But flying the Me-262 was a completely new experience. Training began immediately. The pilots learned to handle the jet's unique characteristics. They practiced takeoffs. The Me-262 required a longer runway than piston fighters. It needed 2,600 feet to lift off. The pilots had to keep the nose down until 180 miles per hour. Then they pulled back gently. They learned to avoid sharp turns during takeoff. The Jumo engines were sensitive to throttle changes. A sudden increase in power could cause a flameout. The pilots also practiced landings. The Me-262 landed at 140 miles per hour. It had a tendency to float above the runway. The pilots had to use precise throttle control to set it down smoothly. The first combat mission of JG-7 took place on July 25, 1944. 6 Me-262s were scrambled to intercept a formation of 120B, 17 flying fortresses. The bombers were heading for a synthetic oil refinery in Hamburg. The Me-262s climbed to 30,000 feet. They positioned themselves above and behind the bomber stream. WWII gave the order to attack. The jets dived toward the B-17s. They flew through the formation at 500 miles per hour. Their 108 Malawian Quachas cannons fired in short bursts. 3 B-17s exploded in flames. 2 more were damaged and forced to turn back. The Me-262s pulled up and climbed back to altitude. They escaped without loss. The Allied pilots were shocked. A P-51 pilot, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, later wrote in his memoir, "I looked up and saw them, silver darts moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. They hit the bombers and were gone. We couldn't catch them. It was like trying to chase a bullet." But the Me-262 had critical flaws. The Jumo 004B engines were unreliable. They were made with low-quality materials. The turbine blades were cast from inferior steel. They often cracked after 15 hours of use. The engines also needed large amounts of high-octane fuel. Germany was running out of this fuel by 1944. Many Me-262s were grounded because of fuel shortages. The plane's landing gear was another weak point. The main gear struts were too thin. They collapsed on rough runways. The nose gear often failed to retract. The fuel system was prone to leaks. The external drop tanks were made of thin aluminum. A single bullet could puncture them. This made the Me-262 vulnerable to enemy fire. The Allies quickly developed tactics to counter the Me-262. They learned that the jets were slow during takeoff and landing. They sent fighter sweeps to attack German airfields. The P-51s and Spitfires would circle above the airfields. They waited for Me-262s to take off or land. Then they attacked. This became known as tank hunting. It was effective. In August 1944, JG-7 lost 12 Me-262s to such attacks. The Allies also used boom and zoom tactics. They would climb to high altitude. They would dive on Me-262s from above. They would fire a quick burst and then climb back to safety. The Me-262s could not outclimb the P-51s at low altitudes. This made them vulnerable to these attacks. Walter WWII was killed on November 8, 1944. He was leading a mission near Aachen, Germany. His Me-262 was intercepted by 2 P-51s. The American pilots, Lieutenants Edward Bud Anderson and John Meyer, attacked from below. Anderson's bullets hit WWII's left engine. It caught fire. WWII tried to bail out, but his parachute became tangled in the plane's tail. He crashed into a field. His death was a severe blow to JG-7. The unit's morale plummeted, but the pilots continued to fly. They knew the Me-262 was Germany's last hope for air superiority. By December 1944, there were 107 Me-262s in service. They were deployed to bases across Europe. From France to Poland, they attacked Allied bombers. They fought fighter sweeps. They even strafed ground targets. But their numbers were too small. The Allies were producing 10,000 fighters per month. Germany could only build 45 Me-262s per month. Bombing raids destroyed the Junkers engine factory in Magdeburg. This reduced engine production by 60%. Fuel shortages grounded half the Me-262s. The jets were fighting a losing battle. One of the most successful Me-262 aces was Franz Schall. Schall was 24 years old. He had 137 victories in Bf-109s. He joined JG-7 in October 1944. He quickly mastered the Me-262. He scored his first jet victory on October 16th. He shot down AP-51D near Osnabrück. Schall was known for his aggressive tactics. He would fly straight into bomber formations. He would get within 300 yards of AB-17. Then he would fire his cannons. He scored 17 victories in the Me-262, including 10 B-17s and 7 P-51s. Schall survived the war. He later recalled, "The Me-262 was the best plane I ever flew. It was fast. It was powerful. But it came too late. We were outnumbered 10 to 1. We didn't have enough fuel. We didn't have enough engines. We did what we could." Another top Me-262 ace was Heinz Bahr. Bahr was a 28-year-old veteran with 220 victories. He joined JG-7 in November 1944. He scored 16 victories in the Me-262. He was known for his skill at evading Allied fighters. Bahr would use the Me-262's speed to outrun pursuers. He would then climb to altitude and circle back. He would attack the Allied fighters from behind. Bahr survived the war. He later said, "The Me-262 was a game changer, but it wasn't a miracle weapon. It needed better engines. It needed more fuel. It needed to be built earlier. If we had 1,000 of them in 1943, the air war would have been different." The Me-262's impact on the strategic bombing campaign was limited. It shot down approximately 500 Allied aircraft. Most of these were bombers. The Allies lost 1,200 bombers to all causes in 1944. The Me-262 accounted for 40% of these losses. But the Allies were able to replace their losses quickly. They also increased the number of fighter escorts. By early 1945, every bomber formation had 100 or more fighter escorts. This made it harder for Me-262s to reach the bombers. The jets were forced to fight their way through the escorts. Many were shot down before they could attack the bombers. The Me-262 also saw service as a reconnaissance aircraft. The Me-262U. One was a photo recon version. It carried 2 cameras in the nose. It could fly over Allied lines at 500 miles per hour. It could take photos of troop positions and airfields. The Allies had no way to intercept it. The U-1 provided valuable intelligence, but it was produced in small numbers. Only 12 were built. The last major combat operation involving Me-262s took place during the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, Hitler launched a massive offensive in the Ardennes forest. He hoped to split the Allied armies. The Luftwaffe deployed 50 Me-262s to support the offensive. They attacked Allied troop concentrations and supply lines. They shot down 23 Allied aircraft, but the offensive failed. The Allies pushed back the German forces. The Me-262s were forced to retreat to bases in Germany. The final combat mission of the Me-262 was flown on April 25, 1945. A single jet from JG-7 took off from a base near Berlin. The pilot, Heinz Arnold, was ordered to attack a formation of B-24 Liberators. Arnold climbed to 25,000 feet. He positioned himself behind the bombers. He fired his cannons. B-24 exploded, but anti-aircraft fire hit Arnold's plane. His right engine caught fire. He bailed out. He landed in a forest. He was captured by Soviet troops the next day. Arnold later said, "I knew the war was over, but I had to fly. It was my duty. The Me-262 was a great plane, but it couldn't stop the inevitable." After the war, the Allies captured hundreds of Me-262s. They were sent to research facilities in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Engineers dissected the jets. They studied the engines, airframe, and systems. The United States took 12 Me-262s to Wright Field in Ohio. They tested the jet's performance. They found that the Me-262 could reach 560 miles per hour in a dive. It could outclimb any American fighter. The engineers copied the swept-wing design. They used it in the F-86 Sabre, America's first jet fighter. The Soviet Union captured 20 Me-262s. They reverse-engineered the Jumo 004B engine. They built a copy called the RD-10. It powered the Yak-15, the Soviet Union's first jet fighter. Willie Messerschmitt was arrested by American troops in May 1945. He was charged with war crimes. The charges centered on the use of slave labor in his factories. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners had worked in Messerschmitt's plants. Many died from starvation and abuse. Messerschmitt was tried in 1948. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. After his release, he returned to aeronautics. He designed civilian aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf-108 was a popular trainer. He also worked on supersonic aircraft designs. Messerschmitt died in 1978. His legacy is controversial. He was a brilliant engineer, but he helped the Nazi regime build weapons of war. The Me-262's legacy extends far beyond World War II. It was the first jet fighter to see combat. It proved that jet propulsion was viable for military aircraft. It changed the course of aviation history. Before Me-262, most engineers thought jets were too slow and unreliable. After the war, every major air force adopted jet fighters. The Me-262's swept-wing design became standard. It reduced drag at high speeds. It allowed planes to fly faster than the speed of sound. The F-86 Sabre, MiG-15, and English Electric Lightning all used swept wings. They all owed a debt to the Me-262. Today, only 30 Me-262 survive. Most are in museums. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. has a Me-262A-1A. It was captured in Germany in 1945. It is displayed in the National Air and Space Museum. The Deutsches Museum in Munich has a Me-262U, one reconnaissance model. A handful of Me-262s have been restored to airworthy condition. In 2003, a restored Me-262 flew an air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. It was the first time a Me-262 had flown in public in 58 years. The crowd cheered as the jet roared overhead. It was a reminder of a time when aviation technology took a giant leap forward. For the pilots who flew the Me-262, the plane was more than a machine. It was a symbol of hope, a symbol of what German engineering could achieve. Many of them were young men. They had seen friends die. They had seen their country destroyed. But when they climbed into Me-262's cockpit, they felt unstoppable. They felt they could make a difference. John Hammond, the RAF pilot who first saw the Me-262 over the channel, survived the war. He flew 89 combat missions. He later became a test pilot. He flew the first British jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor. Hammond said, "The Me-262 scared us. It made us realize we weren't invulnerable. It pushed us to build better planes." In the end, that's the legacy of the Me-262. It made aviation better. It made us better. The Me-262 was a paradox. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity. But it was also a weapon of war, a tool of a brutal regime. It flew too fast for its time. It arrived too late to save Germany. It terrified Allied pilots, but it could not turn the tide of the war. It was a symbol of both progress and desperation. It showed what we can achieve when we push the limits of technology. It also showed the cost of using that technology for destruction. As we look back on the Me-262, we must remember its lessons. We must remember that technology is a double-edged sword. It can be used to improve our lives. It can also be used to kill. We must remember that innovation without ethics is dangerous. We must remember the pilots who flew the Me-262, the young men on both sides who risked their lives. They were not just fighting for their countries. They were fighting for the future of aviation, for the future of technology, for the future of humanity. The Me-262 may have flown too fast. It may have arrived too late, but it will never be forgotten. It will always be remembered as a jet fighter that changed everything. The jet fighter that terrified Allied pilots. The jet fighter that marked the end of the piston era and the beginning of the jet age. Its whine will echo through aviation history forever, a reminder of what we can achieve and what we must avoid.